They not only cut my face out of the family portrait, they tried to bury my soul under $20 million of my own stolen credit. Sante called it an accident. Lowell called it business. But they forgot one thing. I'm an auditor, and I've been counting every second of their betrayal. And tonight, the laughter will be silenced. Because of the compound interest on their lies? Finally, it's time to pay the price. I stared through the frosted glass at the limestone fortress, my heart pounding, chilled by the rising wind. The blizzard outside the Lowell estate didn't just howl. It screamed with a cold, jagged indifference that mirrored the air in my own lungs. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the snow bury the hood in white sheets, as thick and heavy as the secrets this family had kept for 27 years. I adjusted my coat, a simple, charcoal gray wool piece I'd saved 3 months to buy. It was more than clothing. It was my armor. Have you ever felt like a stranger in the very place that was supposed to be your sanctuary? We often pretend to be strong until the right kind of pain finds us. And tonight, I knew the wind wasn't the only thing that was going to bite. I stepped out, the crunch of frozen snow beneath my boots sounding like 1,000 broken promises. My name is Carnelian, a name that means endurance. Yet as I stared at the towering limestone walls of the Gold Coast mansion, I wondered how much more a human heart was meant to sustain. True character is not found in how we celebrate under the bright lights, but in how we endure the silence of those who should love us the most. I took a deep breath, the freezing air burning my throat, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I wasn't here for the wine or the carols. I was here to see if I still existed in their world. The moment I crossed the threshold, the scent of expensive pine and top-shelf bourbon hit me like a physical weight. It was the smell of success, or at least the gilded version of it my father Lowell spent his life polishing. Sante, my stepmother, glided across the marble floor like a swan on a frozen lake. She leaned in for that signature high society air kiss, her lips never touching my skin, her eyes never meeting mine. "Carnelian, you're late," she murmured, her voice as thin as the ice on the driveway. I suppose life in that little West Loop apartment doesn't leave much room for punctuality. Shanda was just telling us about her new penthouse in Miami. It's a shame you couldn't join her for the tour. I didn't take the bait. I simply smiled, the kind of quiet, steady smile that comes from knowing something they don't. I'm happy for her, Sante. Peace is far more valuable than square footage. My voice was calm, but inside I could feel the rhythmic thump of my heart against my ribs, a countdown to a revelation I wasn't yet ready to share. Sante huffed, a tiny sound of dismissal, before turning her back on me to attend to more important guests. I stood there, a ghost in a black coat, watching the people I called family treat my presence as a minor inconvenience. I wondered then, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have let the truth shatter the crystal glasses in their hands? The evening moved with a practiced, hollow elegance. We were eventually ushered into the great room, where the centerpiece of the night awaited. Above the fireplace, a massive velvet shroud covered the new family portrait. Shanda was giggling, her hand resting on Lowell's arm as he puffed on a cigar, radiating the kind of patriarchal pride that only comes from believing you've won the game. "This portrait represents our legacy," Lowell announced, his voice booming with a false warmth. "A record of the Lowell name for generations to come." My stomach tightened as the veil was dropped. The crowd gasped in admiration, but for me, the world went silent. My face wasn't there. It wasn't just cropped or blurred. It had been surgically removed from the composition. In the exact space where I had stood during the photo session, there was now a custom-engraved brass plaque, polished to a mirror finish. I stepped closer, my reflection ghosting over the metal. It bore my name and my birth date, but the date of death was a haunting, empty blank. It was a symbolic burial while I was still standing in the room. "Don't be so sensitive, Carnelian." Sante's voice drifted over my shoulder, light and mocking. "You're so rarely here that we thought a memorial was more appropriate. It balances the frame so much better than an empty chair, don't you think?" I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as they touched the cold, hard brass. The metal felt like a blade. Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting a seat at a table where you are being erased. It means having the courage to build your own table, even if you have to scavenge the wood from the ruins of your past. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply let the weight of that plaque anchor me to a new reality. I turned away from the portrait, my gaze landing on Lowell. He was adjusting his watch, and for a split second, I saw his hand tremor. It was a small thing, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, but as a risk analyst, I lived in the details. Beneath the bravado, there was a rot. He wasn't a titan. He was a man holding onto a sinking ship, and I was the only one who had seen the holes in the hull. I realized then that I wasn't the victim in this room. I was the auditor of their lies. I slipped away from the noise, moving toward the kitchen where Haddon, our elderly housekeeper, was quietly plating the appetizers. The family treated him like the wallpaper, but he had been the only one to send me a card on my birthday when the others forgot. I pulled a small, hand-wrapped box from my bag, a rare book on American history I knew he had been looking for. "Merry Christmas, Haddon," I whispered, pressing it into his worn hands. His eyes softened, a brief flash of genuine humanity in a house made of plastic. "You have your mother's heart, Carnelian," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Don't let them turn it to stone." Underneath my coat, the thick envelope Haddon had leaked to me felt like it was burning a hole in my skin. It contained the preliminary audit of the Ghost LLC, the shell company Lowell had built using my stolen identity and credit score. This Gold Coast mansion, the silk dresses, the vintage scotch, it was all built on a foundation of my stolen future. I felt the weight of the betrayal, a cold, sharp realization that my own father had traded my life for a better zip code. But as the butler announced that dinner was served, I didn't feel weak. I felt prepared. I followed them into the dining room, the sound of their laughter echoing off the walls like a mockery. I took my seat, looking at the empty spaces between us, and felt the quiet, steady power of the truth beginning to rise. Sometimes, the person who saves you is the one you see in the mirror when everyone else has closed their eyes. I adjusted my napkin, my eyes meeting Lowell's across the table. He thought he had erased me, but he had only made me invisible enough to watch him fall. I wasn't a ghost. I was the debt that had finally come due, and I was ready to collect every single cent, starting with the interest they never expected to pay. The gala shifted into high gear, the sound of ice clinking against crystals sounding like the sharp, rhythmic ticking of a countdown. I watched Lowell raise his glass, his chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who thought he had successfully buried his youngest daughter alive. He didn't see me slip away from the pre-dinner drinks, claiming a phantom work call required my attention. I had spent years analyzing risk for the biggest firms in Chicago, but tonight, the greatest risk was standing in the center of the Gold Coast. I navigated the familiar hallways, my footsteps silent on the Persian rugs, until I reached the heavy mahogany door of my father's private study. The air inside the study was stale, thick with the smell of old leather and systemic deceit. I didn't hesitate. I moved directly to the safe behind the framed map of the 19th century Midwest. Haddon's tip had been precise. My fingers moved with clinical speed, and the heavy door groaned open, revealing a stack of ledgers that smelled of rot and ink. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the fine print with the practiced detachment of an auditor. There it was, a shell company named Carnelian Heights LLC, a toxic waste dump for every failed real estate venture Lowell had ever touched. My breathing hitched as I saw the loan agreements, millions of dollars in subprime, high-interest debt, all secured using my social security number and my pristine credit history. He had weaponized my very existence to fund Shanda's lifestyle brand, a vanity project that was hemorrhaging cash faster than a severed artery. Have you ever realized that the people who gave you your name are the ones most likely to sell it for a profit? A parent's legacy should be a foundation, not a furnace where they burn their children's futures to keep themselves warm. I didn't confront them yet. I simply took out my phone and began documenting every page, the flash of the camera the only witness to my cold realization. I moved to the second-floor gallery, looking down at the arriving guests from the shadows of the velvet curtains. A disorienting shock hit me, making the floor feel like it was tilting. There, standing by the marble staircase, was me. Or rather, a woman styled to look exactly like me from a distance, wearing the same charcoal dress I had been seen in at the last charity function, her hair pinned in my exact style. She was greeting a group of influential investors with a compliant, sugary smile I would never possess. Sante hadn't just replaced me in a photo. She had hired a professional identity double to play the role of the perfect daughter while I was being liquidated in the dark. I watched as the double leaned in toward Mr. Abernathy, an elderly veteran and longtime family friend who had always been kind to me. She was approving a fraudulent investment pitch, using my professional reputation at the bank as the ultimate bait to swindle him. My heart ached for him, an old man who believed in the Lowell name. Kindness without boundaries is just self-destruction, but truth without mercy is a weapon I was finally learning to wield. I stood there, a ghost watching a mirage, understanding that my family didn't just want my money. They wanted to wear my skin while they robbed my friends. As I turned to leave the gallery, I nearly collided with Haddon in the dim light of the back hallway. He didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed a small, encrypted thumb drive into my palm. "The articles of incorporation are on here," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the stairs. "Lowell forged your signature, Carnelian. It's too perfect. A machine could tell it was traced from your graduation papers." I squeezed his hand, a brief, tender moment of shared integrity in a house built on sand. Doing the right thing when the people who gave you your name are doing the wrong thing is the hardest form of courage there is. I re-entered the foyer, passing my double as she made her way toward the powder room. For a split second, our eyes met. She looked terrified, her pupils blown wide with the panic of a girl who realized she was way out of her league. I didn't glare at her. I gave her a quiet, reassuring nod, an act of grace toward a stranger being used as a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She wasn't the enemy. She was just another piece of collateral. I straightened my shoulders and made my way toward the dining room, where the scent of roasted duck and hypocrisy awaited. I took my seat at the long table, the mahogany feeling like a coffin lid under my hands. Lowell sat at the head, radiant with the glow of a man who thought he had finally secured his kingdom. He raised his glass for a toast, the light catching the bubbles in the champagne. "To family!" he boomed, his voice filled with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "And to the futures we build for those we love." As the guests raised their glasses, my phone vibrated in my lap. It was a notification from the encrypted software I'd set up to track the shell company's activity. The first interest calculation for the stolen loans had just hit the server. The number was astronomical, a debt that would take 3 lifetimes to pay. Lowell was still grinning, unaware that he was toasting to a vault I had already unlocked. I stared across the table at Lowell, whose face was illuminated by the flickering warmth of the centerpiece candles. He looked so paternal, so steady, while the notification on my screen mapped out a debt that would take 3 lifetimes to resolve. I didn't let my expression flicker. I simply excused myself again, murmuring something about the wine being a bit too heavy for my stomach, and slipped away into the cooling shadows of the back hallway. I descended the stone steps into the wine cellar, the temperature dropping with every step until the air felt as sharp and biting as a fresh blade. Haddon was waiting in the corner, obscured by the racks of vintage Bordeaux. He didn't say a word. He simply handed me a leather-bound folder, his hands steady despite the chaos brewing upstairs. I opened it under the dim amber light of a wall sconce. My eyes blurred for a second as I read the heading. Private Settlement Agreement. It wasn't a bank loan. It was a trade. The horrific truth unfolded in cold, legal type. Lowell hadn't just used my credit to keep Shandaw's failing vanity projects afloat. He had used me as human collateral. To wipe out a $20 million debt with a high-stakes creditor, he had signed a contract promising to facilitate a marriage between me and the creditor's eldest son. It was a sophisticated form of modern-day indentured servitude, a high-society merger where I was the primary asset being liquidated. He had utilized a general power of attorney I'd signed years ago, thinking I was merely helping with Grandpa's estate. I felt the air leave my lungs, a hollow, crushing sensation that made the stone walls feel like they were closing in. For a moment, my stoic armor cracked. How does a father look at his youngest daughter and see nothing but a bargaining chip? They say you can't choose your family, but you can certainly choose when to stop being their currency. My life is not a line item on a balance sheet. I forced the panic down, replacing it with a cold, analytical focus. I wasn't just Carnelian the daughter anymore. I was the auditor, and I was looking at a massive, fraudulent liability. Haddon touched my arm, his eyes reflecting a deep, weathered grief. He didn't try to offer empty comfort. He led me deeper into the cellar, past the expensive vintages to a crumbling section of the back wall. He moved a loose brick behind an old crate of Riesling, reaching into the dark cavity to produce an object wrapped in tattered velvet. As he pulled the cloth away, I saw an old, ornate music box, its wood inlaid with mother-of-pearl that shimmered like a dying star in the gloom. It was the only thing I remembered from my early childhood, before the accident that allegedly took my mother's life. I opened the lid, and a delicate, haunting melody began to play, the gears groaning with the weight of years. Inside, tucked into a hidden compartment at the base, was a birth certificate and a sealed letter. I felt the world tilt on its axis. Sante was not my biological mother. She was the woman who had moved in months after my mother's disappearance, systematically erasing every photograph, every memory, and every legal trace of the woman who had actually brought me into the world. Sante hadn't just replaced me in a photo. She had replaced my entire history to seize an ancestral trust that was never hers to touch. The letter was from my biological mother, written in a hand that looked remarkably like my own. She had known the darkness in Lowell even then. She had established a massive, untouched trust fund specifically for me, protected by a series of legal safeguards that Lowell and Sante had spent the last decade trying to break. The debt, the Ghost LLC, the attempts to frame me as mentally unstable. It was all a coordinated assault to strip me of my legal standing so they could finally reach the core of that trust. Kindness is a legacy that survives even the most calculated greed, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't the daughter of a thief. I was the heir of a woman they couldn't silence. I looked at Haddon, the only man in this house who hadn't sold his soul. He had risked everything, his pension, his safety, his home, to keep these fragments of the truth safe for me. I reached out and took his hand, the skin like parchment. "Loyalty like yours isn't bought, Haddon," I whispered, my voice thick with a genuine emotion I rarely allowed myself. "It's earned through a lifetime of being the only honest man in a house of mirrors. I won't let them hurt you for this." He simply nodded, a silent guardian who had finally fulfilled his vow. I closed the music box, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the stone ceiling above us. I began to integrate the new data. The human collateral contract was the ultimate evidence of fraud. If I could prove the power of attorney was obtained under false pretenses or used outside its intended scope, the entire Ghost LLC structure would collapse like a house of cards. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was reclaiming a lineage that had been stolen. The greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies, but ensuring they no longer have the power to define who you are. I took a final moment in the darkness to breathe, centering my mind before returning to the theater of the gala. I could hear the hollow, practiced laughter of the guests drifting down the stairs, a sound that no longer carried any power over me. I adjusted my dress, smoothing the silk over my heart where the music box now lay hidden in the inner pocket of my wrap. I looked at the dark corners of the cellar and made a silent vow to the woman who had left that letter. They had tried to turn me into a shadow, but tonight, I was going to be the light that burned their illusions to ash. I walked back up the stairs, my footsteps firm and rhythmic. As I passed the great room, I glanced at the replacement plaque above the fireplace one last time. It didn't make my stomach churn anymore. It looked small. It looked pathetic. I wasn't going back to that dinner as the youngest daughter who needed to be seen. I was going back as the executor of a debt they could never hope to pay. Lowell was still at the table, probably rehearsing his next lie, unaware that the daughter he thought he had bartered away was about to foreclose on his entire existence. The heavy mahogany doors of the library clicked shut with a finality that echoed in the pit of my stomach. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of books that Lowell had likely never read, their gold-leaf spines gleaming under the dim light of a single green-shaded desk lamp. The air here was different, colder, stripped of the festive artificiality of the gala outside. My name is Carnelian, and for the first time in 27 years, I wasn't looking at this room as a daughter seeking approval. I was looking at a crime scene. Lowell sat behind his massive oak desk, the silhouette of his frame cast in long, jagged shadows against the wall. He gestured toward a crystal decanter, his voice smooth, practiced, and dripping with a paternal concern that felt as oily as a slick on a pristine lake. "Sit down, Carnelian. You look tired. Perhaps a glass of scotch? It's the 30-year-old Macallan you used to love." I didn't move. I knew the taste of that scotch. It was the same flavor as every lie he had ever fed me, expensive, biting, and designed to dull the senses. "I'm not here for a drink, Lowell. I'm here for the truth." He sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. "The truth is a heavy burden, sweetheart. Everything I've done, the LLCs, the loans, was to shield you from the complexities of this world. Family is a fortress, and sometimes the walls have to be built in ways the inhabitants don't quite understand." He spoke of debt as if it were a lullaby, and of fraud as if it were a birthright. I watched his hands. He was trying to maintain the image of the stoic patriarch, but the desperate clench of his jaw told a different story. A man who uses his daughter as a shield has already admitted he is a coward. Tonight, I was no longer his shield. I was his auditor. "Shielding me?" I finally spoke, my voice a low, steady chime in the quiet room. "You didn't shield me, Lowell. You liquidated me. You forged my signatures to buy Shanda a life she didn't earn while you turned my credit score into a graveyard for your bad investments." I laid out the facts, dates, dollar amounts, the exact interest rates of the subprime loans he'd secured in my name. I watched him try to gaslight me, his eyes narrowing as he suggested I was misremembering or overreacting. But the numbers don't lie, and neither do the forensic trails left in the digital dark. I reminded him that a parent's greatest duty is to prepare a child for the world, not to steal the world from the child. The atmosphere shifted. The mask of the concerned father slipped, revealing the jagged edge of a cornered animal. Lowell didn't argue further. Instead, he reached into a drawer and slid a thick manila folder across the polished surface of the desk. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this," he whispered, his tone now sharp and clinical. "But your behavior lately? This obsession with documents, these delusions of grand conspiracies? Sante and I have been very worried about your mental health." I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the documents, and a chill of pure, unadulterated horror raced down my spine. It was a medical evaluation and a formal petition for guardianship. He had spent months, and likely a small fortune, paying off a corrupt psychiatrist to build a case that I was mentally unstable, prone to dissociative episodes, and incapable of managing my own affairs. It was the American conservatorship nightmare, a legal cage designed to strip a person of their autonomy under the guise of protection. "You have two choices, Carnelian," Lowell said, his eyes now as cold as the blizzard outside. "You sign this permanent general power of attorney and a non-disclosure agreement regarding all family finances, and we will manage your care at home. Or, by tomorrow morning, this petition will be filed. You'll be committed to a private facility, and you will lose your legal right to possess so much as a library card, let alone that trust fund your mother left you." He intended to use my insanity to invalidate the trust Haddon had shown me in the cellar. The betrayal was total. They didn't just want my money, they wanted to erase my mind. But a locked door only works if the person inside doesn't have the key to the entire house. For a moment, I let him see the fear in my eyes, a tactical surrender to feed his overconfidence. I took a shaky breath, letting my hand hover over the manila folder. "You would really do this? You would lock your own daughter away just to keep the lights on in this house?" He didn't blink. "I would do whatever is necessary to protect the Lowell name." Then I straightened my back. The instability he thought he saw vanished, replaced by a clarity that seemed to make the air in the room hum. I reached into the hidden pocket of my wrap and pulled out my phone. That was a very enlightening confession, Lowell. Did you get it all? I tapped the screen, showing the active high-fidelity recording that had captured every word of his ultimatum. This is already on a secure cloud server. So is the encrypted drive Haddon gave me. If I don't check in with my legal team in the next hour, it all goes to the district attorney and the Federal Reserve. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and diminished in his leather chair. I felt a sudden, profound wave of tragic mercy for the man in front of me. I didn't hate him. I pitied him. I don't hate you, Lowell. I pity you. You've traded a daughter's love for a house made of debt and paper. You can try to lock me in a cage, but you've forgotten that I'm the one who designed the bars. I stood up, smoothing my coat, the weight of the music box in my pocket feeling like a steadying hand. I walked toward the library doors, stopping only to look back at the silhouette of the man who had tried to erase me. Sometimes the only way to save a family is to let the version they built burn down so something honest can grow in its place. I'm not the ghost in this house, Lowell. You are. I adjusted my scarf, feeling the rhythmic, pulse-pounding strength of a woman who had finally found her limits and crossed them. Dinner is served, I said, my voice echoing in the hallway. Let's not keep the guests, or the creditors, waiting. It's New Year's Eve, after all. A perfect time for everything to end. I walked out into the light of the foyer, leaving him alone in the dark with his folder of lies. Have you ever felt the moment the chains finally snap? It doesn't sound like a crash. It sounds like a whisper of a promise kept to yourself. I headed toward the dining room, knowing the engagement party he had planned for me was about to become his own public trial. The walk from the library to the grand dining room felt like a march toward a cliff edge, yet my heart remained steady, anchored by the cold weight of the music box in my pocket. I re-entered a sea of silken lies, the New Year's Eve gala now reaching its fever pitch. Crystal chandeliers cast a deceptive, glittering warmth over Chicago's elite. But all I could smell was the ozone of an approaching storm. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and realized that every smile was a transaction? I took my seat at the head table, the very picture of stoic grace, while around me, the architecture of my family's deceit began to groan under its own weight. Shanda sat across from me, her designer gown shimmering like oil on water, a garment that literally cost more than a 4-year degree. She didn't hesitate to resume her sport of the evening, leaning toward a city councilman to mock my drab career as a risk analyst. Carnelian is so dedicated to her spreadsheets, she chirped, her laughter ringing hollow. I suppose someone has to do the boring work while the rest of us live. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at her, knowing the exact market value of the chair she sat in, and knowing that by tomorrow, she wouldn't even own the shoes on her feet. Home is supposed to be where they have to take you in, but in this house, home was just a stage where they tried to bury me under the applause of strangers. I caught Haddon's eye from across the room. He was standing by the mahogany sideboard, a shadow among the silver service. He gave me a single, imperceptible nod, the signal that the digital countdown I'd initiated in the library had reached 0. A wave of profound pity washed over me as I looked at the guests. They were dining on the finest caviar, blissfully unaware that they were attending a wake for the Lowell dynasty. It made me wonder, how many of us are living in houses built on sand, just waiting for the first wave of truth to hit the shore? The room suddenly fell into a scripted silence as Lowell stood, clinking a vintage crystal glass to command attention. He wore his beloved patriarch persona like a well-tailored suit, his voice booming with a false, practiced warmth that made my skin crawl. He spoke of legacy, of family unity, and of the exciting new chapter that would define the Lowell name in the coming year. I watched him closely, seeing the predatory glint in his eyes that he usually reserved for closing a hostile takeover. He wasn't talking to a family. He was talking to a board of directors. Then came the strike. Tonight, Lowell announced, his gaze locking onto mine with a terrifying finality. We celebrate a merger of hearts and assets. I am overjoyed to announce the surprise engagement of my youngest daughter, Carnelian, to Julian Vane. The room erupted in a choreographed burst of cheers as a man I barely recognized, the son of the creditor Lowell owed $20 million, stepped forward, holding a diamond ring that caught the light like a jagged shard of ice. Sante leaned into my ear, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. "Smile, Carnelian," she hissed. "If you don't play along, the psychiatric transport is already at the back gate. This is your last chance to be useful to us." The betrayal was so clinical, so devoid of human empathy, that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They had staged a public execution of my autonomy, betting that my desire to avoid a scene would force me into a life of indentured servitude. But they had forgotten one thing. A woman who has already been erased has nothing left to fear from the shadows. I stood up slowly, my silhouette sharp and defiant against the flickering candlelight. The room went bone silent, 100 pairs of eyes expecting a tearful, compliant yes. Instead, I looked at the crowd with a profound, calm pity that seemed to unsettle the air itself. I addressed the room, my voice steady and resonant, carrying the authority of a woman who had finally found the floor of her own soul. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," I said, my words cutting through the festive hum like a bell in the fog. "And a family built on the theft of a child's identity has no floor left to dance on." I turned my gaze to Lowell and Sante, not with hate, but with the chilling finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "You think you've backed me into a corner? You've forgotten that I'm the one who mapped the maze. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a line of credit." I reached into my wrap and pulled out a silver folder, the physical manifestation of my years of calculated silence. I placed it on the table between the untouched lobster and the stolen champagne. It was the interest bill, an itemized audit of every cent they had bled from my name, compounded by the cost of their betrayal. I am not your collateral, Lowell. And I am certainly not for sale. The shock in the room was palpable. A collective intake of breath as the gilded mask of the Lowell family finally began to crack in front of the very people they sought to impress. Lowell's hand reached for the folder, his face a mask of purple rage. But before his fingers could touch the paper, the house lights flickered and the orchestra's music died with a discordant moan. Simultaneously, every guest's phone in the room pings with a sharp, synchronized notification. It was a public filing alert from the state's Financial Crimes Division, a notification that Carnelian Heights LLC had been flagged for immediate federal investigation. I leaned in close to Lowell, my voice a whisper that only he could hear. "Happy New Year, Lowell. The debt has finally come due, and I'm the one who's calling it in." I looked down at the ring on the table, a diamond bought with the very future they had tried to steal from me. It was beautiful, but it was just carbon and greed. Some chains are made of gold, but they still break under the weight of the truth. I felt a strange, quiet surge of freedom, a realization that I no longer needed their permission to exist. The air in the grand dining room felt like a glass bottle under immense pressure, ready to shatter at the slightest vibration. I moved with a clinical, unhurried precision, sliding the ivory folder across the mahogany table. It didn't slide smoothly. It moved with a heavy, rhythmic friction, coming to a stop directly in front of Lowell's shaking hands. The room fell into a silence so absolute that the flickering of the candles sounded like thunder. The elite guests, those high society vultures who had been laughing moments ago, were now frozen like statues in a gallery of their own collective greed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I began to read the itemized bill, my tone as cold and detached as a court recorder. I wasn't just demanding the principal they had stolen. I was presenting the compound interest of betrayal. I had calculated every identity theft loan, every forged LLC, and every stolen year of my life at the highest market rates allowed by law. The total figure on the final page exceeded $100 million, a number that represented the true cost of their vanity. Lowell tried to let out a short, bark-like laugh, calling it a childish joke, but the sound died instantly when he saw the certified forensic audit seal and the crisp signatures of 3 federal bank examiners. I looked at my father, and for the first time, I didn't see a giant. I saw a hollow man. A parent who steals from his child's future to polish his own present hasn't just lost his money. He has lost the only thing that actually appreciates in value: his humanity. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't an act of revenge. I am not a person driven by spite. This was a rebalancing of the books, a long overdue audit of a family that had been insolvent in character for decades. Justice is not a flame that burns down the house. It is the light that finally reveals the house was already empty. The tension broke into a frantic, ugly chaos. Shanda, her face pale beneath her expensive makeup, tried to brush the moment aside by shouting for more champagne. She pulled out her black platinum card and tried to thrust it at a server, demanding they ignore my delusions. The transaction was declined. She tried another card, then a third. Each time, the machine emitted a sharp, mocking beep of rejection. She looked at the cards as if they had betrayed her, her eyes wide with a realization that was finally starting to sink in. That was the moment I revealed the digital coup. Using my seniority at the investment bank and the evidence of the forged LLCs, I had legally flagged every account linked to Lowell and Santee for suspected fraudulent activity. Every card in that room belonging to them was now nothing more than a useless piece of plastic. As if on cue, the lights in the mansion dimmed to emergency levels. The automated payment systems for the estate's utilities, all tied to the frozen accounts, had begun to fail. The high society dream was losing its power, one circuit at a time. Lowell surged to his feet, his face a mask of purple rage as he screamed that I couldn't do this to my own blood. My name is Carnelian, and I let the weight of that name settle between us like a barrier. You stopped being my blood the moment you started treating me as your collateral, I said, my voice cutting through his noise with surgical sharpness. I am not your daughter tonight, Lowell. I am your largest creditor, and I've come to collect. The guests began to murmur, the scent of scandal more intoxicating to them than the wine they were no longer allowed to drink. Lowell lunged at me in a fit of primal, unthinking rage, his hand raised to strike. But he never reached me. Haddon stepped from the shadows, followed by a group of men in dark, understated suits, federal marshals and legal counsel. The very guardianship Lowell had tried to weaponize against me in the library was now officially served back to him as a criminal indictment for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The room erupted into a symphony of hushed whispers and the clicking of phone cameras. The hunters had become the hunted. Amidst the wreckage of the gala, I saw Santee. She was weeping, but her tears weren't for the daughter she had tried to erase or the husband who was being led away. She was weeping for her lost status, for the silk and the stones that were being stripped from her life. I leaned in close to her, the scent of her expensive perfume now smelling like rot. I hope you find peace in a life where you don't have to pretend to love anyone to stay warm, I whispered. I reached out and took a small gold locket from the table, the only thing that had truly belonged to my biological mother. I placed it in my pocket, feeling its warmth. Real power isn't in what you own. It's in what no one can ever take away from you. They owned the house, the cars, and the reputation, but I was the only one who had ever owned the truth. I looked around the room one last time, seeing the replacement portrait above the fireplace. It looked small now, a pathetic attempt to hide a truth that had finally broken through the frame. The clock on the mantel began to strike midnight, the deep chimes mingling with the distant, muffled booms of New Year's fireworks over the city. I turned toward the grand oak doors, my steps steady and light. I saw Haddon waiting by the car at the end of the driveway, his silhouette a quiet testament to a loyalty that couldn't be bought. The cold wind of the Gold Coast no longer bites. Instead, it feels like a soft exhale of a long-held breath. 30 days have passed since the New Year's Eve gala. 30 days since the world I once called home collapsed into a pile of fraudulent ledgers and shattered illusions. I stand across the street from the limestone mansion, my breath blooming in the crisp Chicago air. From this distance, the house looks small, its towering arrogance replaced by the clinical gray hum of a crime scene. I watch as federal authorities carry out the last of the evidence, and for a brief moment, the replacement portrait catches the winter sun. The brass plaque where my face used to be glints one last time before being tossed into the back of a van. It is no longer a memorial to my absence. It is a discarded relic of a false dynasty. The legal reality is as cold and immovable as the granite steps of the courthouse. Lowell and Sante are facing multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and aggravated identity theft. My name, Carnelian, is no longer a tool for their exploitation. It is the primary signature on the documents that sealed their fate. I didn't provide that evidence out of a hunger for revenge. I did it because justice is the only language that greed truly understands, and to remain silent would have been to remain a victim. I received a letter from Shanda this morning, written on cheap stationery from a cramped studio apartment. She blamed me for ruining the family. I didn't reply, but the thought stayed with me. We don't ruin families by telling the truth. We simply expose the ruins that were already there. In the quiet aftermath, I found a different kind of strength. Not the strength to destroy, but the strength to heal. I used a portion of the trust fund my biological mother left me to pay for the legal defense and psychiatric counseling of the girl Sante had hired to be my double. She was just a pawn, another soul bartered in their quest for status. Kindness is a quiet power, and recognizing that she was as much a victim as I was felt like the first real act of freedom I had ever performed. Sometimes the most profound mercy is realizing that the people who hurt you were often just as trapped as you were. I've moved into a new home now, a sun-drenched brownstone in Lincoln Park that smells of fresh cedar and lemon oil instead of old scotch and lies. There are no ghosts here. The windows are large, inviting the light to dance across floors that haven't been walked on by people who only see you as collateral. Haddon visits every Sunday, no longer a man who has to hide in the shadows of a cellar. He sits in my sunroom as a guest, a cherished advisor who finally gets to breathe. "You have her eyes, Carnelian," he told me today, his voice soft with a peace I've never seen in him before. I smiled and adjusted the tea service. I have her eyes, Haddon, but I finally have my own voice. With Haddon's help, I've established the Carnelian Foundation. It's a non-profit dedicated to assisting victims of paper abuse, those whose lives and futures have been mortgaged by the very people supposed to protect them. I'm turning my trauma into a shield for others, ensuring that no one else has to stand in a room and feel themselves being erased. Real inheritance isn't found in a bank vault. It's found in the courage to stand alone until you find the people who truly see you. The morning sun began to crawl across the walls of my new living room, hitting the space above the fireplace. I stood there holding a simple, elegant frame I'd bought at a local market. Inside wasn't an oil painting or a professional studio shot. It was a photograph Haddon took of me at dawn on a Chicago beach, just days after I left the Gold Coast. I'm standing alone against the horizon, the orange light of the rising sun catching the edges of my hair. There is no one else in the shot. No one was cut out, and no one is needed to balance the composition. It is the portrait of one. I hung the frame with a steady hand, watching as the light made the image glow. This is my declaration of self-ownership. I am no longer a replacement, or a piece of collateral in someone else's gamble. I am the sole author of my story, and the ink I use is permanent. I thought about the blizzard, the brass plaque, and the cold mahogany table, and I realized I didn't win by taking their house. I won by realizing I never belonged in it. The most powerful thing you can do is walk away and leave the door wide open for the truth to follow you out. I stepped back, looking at the photo as the house settled into a comfortable, honest silence. For the first time in 27 years, I didn't feel like a ghost or a debt. I felt real. I felt visible. I leaned against the doorframe, a faint smile on my lips as I looked out at the street. The story of the girl who was erased has ended, but the life of the woman who survived is only on its first page. I took a deep, clean breath of the winter air. I am finally home, I whispered to the empty room, and for the first time, I can actually see myself. They thought they could bankrupt my soul, but you can't put a price on the truth. Choosing myself wasn't an act of war. It was an act of survival. I know many of you have sat at tables where you were treated as collateral instead of family. If you've ever had to walk through the fire just to find your own voice, I want to hear from you. Share your journey in the comments below. I'm reading every one of them.